The night Mara first saw the wolf, she was doing what she always did when the rest of the Thornwood clan gathered for celebrations she was never quite invited to. She was working. The archive sat at the eastern edge of the settlement, a long stone building that most people treated the way they treated old scars, acknowledging its existence without ever really wanting to look at it directly. It housed 400 years of pack history in the form of handwritten ledgers, rolled maps, pressed, ceremonial seals, and boxes of correspondence that smelled like dust and old decisions. Mara had reorganized the entire collection 3 times in the 6 years since Elder Devon had assigned her there, partly because the original organization had been genuinely chaotic, and partly because reorganizing things gave her something to do with her hands when the quiet became too loud. She was cross-referencing a set of territorial boundary records from the previous century with a newer survey map when she heard it. Not a sound, exactly. More like the absence of sound, spreading outward from the tree line the way a bruise spreads from a point of impact. Slowly, and then all at once. The night insects stopped. The wind stopped. Even the distant noise of the celebration in the central hall, the laughter and the drums and the voices layered over each other in the particular chaos of pack gatherings, seemed to recede, as if someone had placed a glass dome over the world, and all the sound was now trapped somewhere else. Mara set down her quill. She did not know why she walked to the window. She would think about that later, lying awake in the dark, and she would not be able to explain it. She had not heard anything. There was nothing to investigate, and yet her feet carried her across the stone floor to the narrow window that faced the forest, and she pressed her fingers to the sill, and she looked out into the dark between the trees. He was standing at the boundary. She knew immediately that she was not looking at an ordinary wolf. She had grown up in a pack. She had seen alphas shift, had watched the largest, most powerful wolves in the Thornwood clan move through the forest on patrol nights, had even, once, seen the Alpha Prime of the Eastern Coalition demonstrate his shift at the Border Summit 7 years ago in a display of dominance that had made every Omega within 50 yards instinctively lower their eyes. She knew what a large wolf looked like. She knew the upper range of what was possible. This was not within that range. The wolf at the tree line was the size of a draft horse. Larger, perhaps. It was difficult to calibrate because there was nothing nearby to compare it against, and some part of Mara's mind was actively resisting the mathematics of what she was seeing, the way her brain kept trying to reframe it as distance, as shadow, as a trick of the light from the celebration lanterns strung across the central hall. But the celebration lanterns did not reach this far, and the moon was full and high, and what she was seeing was a wolf, the color of storm clouds, gray-black and enormous, with a ruff around its shoulders like a mantle of dark fur that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. Its eyes were amber, not the ordinary amber of a shifted pack wolf, which was warm and animal and familiar. This amber was deeper, older. It had the quality of light seen through very old glass, slightly warped, carrying within it the suggestion of other colors that had been subsumed over time. Those eyes were looking directly at her. Mara did not move. She was not, in that moment, making a conscious decision to hold still. She simply found that movement was not available to her, that her body had made its own assessment of the situation and determined that the correct response was absolute stillness, the way prey animals freeze when something enormous passes nearby. But she was also, in some quieter part of herself, aware that she did not feel like prey. She felt like something else. She felt like a variable that had just been identified in an equation that had been unsolvable for a very long time. The wolf looked at her for what might have been 30 seconds, or might have been 3 minutes. Mara had no reliable sense of the time that passed. Then it turned, slowly, with the unhurried deliberateness of something that had never in its existence needed to move quickly, because nothing had ever been fast enough to threaten it, and it walked back into the forest. The sound returned gradually, the way water levels out after a stone is dropped into it. Insects first, then wind, then the distant celebration, and Mara stood at the window of the archive with her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her fingertips, staring at the empty tree line. She went back to her desk. She opened the oldest section of the collection, the part that was housed in a climate-controlled cabinet because the materials were too fragile for regular handling, and she pulled out the record she had read so many times that she had memorized significant portions of it, but had never, until tonight, believed in the way you believe in something real, rather than something historical. The record was titled, in the cramped handwriting of an archivist who had lived 340 years before Mara was born, Account of the Dark Forest Wolf, being a true and faithful record of the events of the third moon of the year of the silver. Convergence, set down by archive keeper Solon of Clan Thornwood. Mara read it again, from the beginning. Then she read it a second time. Then she sat very still in her chair for a long moment, looking at nothing, while the implications of what she had just seen reorganized themselves inside her head like pieces of a map finally being laid in their correct positions. She did not tell anyone what she had seen that night. This was not a difficult decision. There was no one she would have told. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is where we tell the stories that keep you up at night, the ones with teeth and hearts and endings you won't see coming. If you've been here before, you already know to get comfortable. This one is going to take a while. The Thornwood clan occupied a territory that stretched from the base of the Greymount Range in the north to the edge of the Delvin Marshes in the south, a span of roughly 400 square kilometers of mixed forest, highland meadow, and river valley that their ancestors had held for 11 generations. They were not the largest pack in the region. That distinction belonged to the Ashvale Confederation to the west, which operated less like a traditional pack and more like a loose federation of subfamilies under a shared banner. Thornwood was mid-sized, stable, and had a reputation for producing excellent trackers and mediocre politicians, which suited most of its members fine. The pack's social structure was conventionally hierarchical. At the top was Alpha Prime Roran, who had held his position for 18 years through a combination of genuine physical dominance, reasonable intelligence, and a talent for appearing more decisive than he actually was. Below him was a council of 4 senior alphas who functioned as both advisors and a check on his authority, though in practice the check was rarely applied. Below them were the general pack membership, divided loosely into alpha, beta, and omega designations that determined social role, expected behavior, and access to resources in ways that everyone accepted as natural, because they had been born into a system that presented itself as nature. Mara was an omega. She had known this since her designation manifested at 16, which was not surprising given her family history. Her mother had been an omega, and her father, who had left the pack before Mara was old enough to remember him clearly, had been one as well. What was somewhat unusual was that she was an unmated omega approaching 30, which in Thornwood terms placed her in a social category that did not have a clean name, but was understood by everyone to mean something slightly off, slightly uncalibrated, slightly outside the expected sequence of a life lived correctly. She had been offered matches, 3 times formally, by the council's mating liaison, who presented the candidates with the careful neutrality of someone describing furniture. She had declined all 3, politely but without elaboration, and after the 3rd declination, the offers had stopped coming. The liaison had noted in the pack records that Mara of Thornwood had chosen the path of dedicated service, which was the official terminology for what happened when an omega remained unmated by choice, and which carried with it a faint but unmistakable implication of something missing, some deficiency of desire or desirability that had produced this outcome. Mara was aware of this implication. She did not spend a great deal of energy arguing against it, because arguing would have required explaining, and explaining would have required articulating something she had not yet fully articulated to herself, that she had declined those matches, not because she lacked desire, but because none of those men had ever, in any of their interactions with her, given her the sense that they were actually interested in her specifically. They were interested in the role she could fill, in the social function she could perform, in having an omega in their household who would manage the domestic sphere while they occupied themselves with the more visible work of pack life. She had looked at each of them and seen, behind their careful courtesy, that she was interchangeable, that any reasonably competent Omega would have done as well, and something in her had refused that with a quiet but absolute certainty, the way a compass needle refuses to point anywhere except north. She was not sure what she was waiting for. She was not sure she was waiting for anything. She had her work, and her work was genuinely absorbing, and on most days that was enough. On the morning after she saw the wolf, it was not quite enough. She went through the archive's regular duties with mechanical competence, cataloging a new acquisition of correspondence from the Voss-Pack border negotiations, and transcribing a set of oral history recordings that one of the senior betas had made with elderly pack members before their memories deteriorated further. She did this efficiently and without error, because that was how she did everything. But underneath the routine, her mind kept returning to the record she had read the night before, and to the amber eyes at the tree line. The record described an event that had occurred 340 years ago, in what the old calendars called the Year of the Silver Convergence, when the 3 moons had aligned in a configuration that happened once every 3 centuries and was considered by pre-modern pack tradition to be a moment when the boundaries between the ordinary world and something older and stranger became permeable. The archivist Solon had been a young man at the time, serving his first year in the archive under an elder keeper, and he had written the account with the particular combination of precision and awe that characterized someone trying very hard to be a reliable witness to something that strained his capacity for reliability. A wolf had emerged. From the dark forest, which was the traditional name for the oldest section of the Thornwood territory, the part where the trees were wide enough to require 3 people linking hands to encircle them, and where the undergrowth was so dense that pack patrols moved through it in single file and did not linger. The wolf had been enormous, larger than any natural wolf, storm-gray and amber-eyed, and it had stood at the boundary of the settlement for 1 full night before retreating at dawn. It had returned the following night, and the night after that. On the 4th night, it had not retreated at dawn. Instead, as the sun rose, the wolf had shifted, and what emerged from the shift was a man. Solon's description of the man was careful and detailed in the way that suggested he had been frightened and was using precision as a defense against the fear. The man had been tall, broad-shouldered, with gray-black hair that fell past his shoulders and eyes that were amber even in human form, which was unusual enough to be notable. He had been naked, as shifted wolves always were, and he had been disoriented, which Solon described as a confusion not of the mind, but of the time, as one who has slept for many years and finds the world rearranged around the fixed point of his waking. The man had spoken. He had spoken in an archaic dialect of the pack language that Solon had only partially understood, but the elder keeper, who had spent decades studying historical linguistics, had been able to translate the essential content. The man had said that he had been sealed, that the sealing had been intended to last until the convergence called him back, that he was Calum, who had been king of the first Thornwood, and that he had returned because his mate was here. Solon's account became somewhat fragmented at this point, which Mara had always attributed to the emotional weight of what he had been trying to record. But the essential facts were clear enough. The council of that era had not believed the man's claim to be the first king, had treated him as a trespasser and possible threat, and had confined him while they deliberated. The deliberation had lasted 3 days. On the 3rd day, the man had walked out of the confinement, not by force, but because the walls had simply ceased to be an obstacle for him in a way that no one present had been able to adequately explain afterward. He had gone back into the dark forest. He had not been seen again. Solon's final note read, "I believe he was telling the truth. I believe we failed him. I believe he will come back, because whatever calls him here is patient, and 3 centuries is nothing to something that old." Mara had first read that account when she was 19 years old, newly installed in the archive, and working her way through the historical collection with the systematic thoroughness that would later become her professional signature. She had filed it under anomalous events, unverified, and thought about it, occasionally over the following decade, with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she found interesting, but had no immediate framework for. Now she pulled it out again, and set it on her desk, and looked at it differently. The silver convergence occurred once every 3 centuries. She had noted this 2 years ago when updating the astronomical records, had cross-referenced it with the historical calendar, and had mentioned it in a quarterly report to Elder Davin as a point of historical interest. The convergence was scheduled for the 3rd moon of this year. The 3rd moon began in 11 days. Mara sat with this information for a long time. Then she began, very methodically, to review everything else in the archive that touched on the first Thornwood, the ancient period before the current pack structure, when the territory had been governed differently, and the stories about what had governed it were categorized as legend, because no one wanted to take responsibility for determining where legend ended and history began. She worked through the night. She drank 3 cups of the bitter tea she kept for late sessions, and ate nothing and did not notice either of these facts until the sun was coming up, and her lower back was aching from sitting for too long in a posture she should have corrected hours earlier. What she had found, accumulated across dozens of sources that had never been cross-referenced with each other because no one had thought to look for the pattern, was this. The first Thornwood had not been governed by an Alpha Council. It had been governed by a single figure who appeared in the records under several names. The First King, the Forest-Bound, the Sealed One, and most commonly, simply the Ancient. The records agreed on certain physical details with the consistency that suggested they were drawing on genuine memory rather than embellishment. Enormous, storm gray in wolf form, amber-eyed in both forms, present at the founding of the territory, and then absent for reasons that the sources described variously as a great ceiling, the long sleep, and the king's bargain with the deep forest. The records also agreed, with less emphasis but with consistent frequency, on one other detail. The Ancient had a mate. The mate was described differently in different sources, as you would expect across centuries of oral transmission gradually becoming written record, but the common thread was persistent. She was not an alpha. She was quiet. She was overlooked. She was the keeper of things, the one who remembered, the one who knew. And when she appeared in the story, the Ancient always found his way home. Mara closed the last document. She looked at her hands on the desk. She listened to the morning sounds of the pack waking up around the settlement, the particular shuffle and noise of a community beginning its day, and she thought about amber eyes finding her in the dark through a narrow window, and she thought about being very carefully, very deliberately overlooked for her entire adult life, and she thought about a note written 340 years ago by a young archivist who had believed something that everyone else dismissed. She thought, I am not going to dismiss it. And then she thought, I am also not going to tell anyone. Not yet. Not until I know more. She went home to sleep for 4 hours. And then she came back, because there was more to know. And she was the only one who would look for it. The wolf came back the next night. Mara was ready for it this time, in the sense that she had positioned her desk chair to face the window, and had her notes spread out in front of her so she could work while also watching the tree line, which was the closest thing to preparation she could manage, given that she had no idea what she was preparing for. She had also, in a practical concession to uncertainty, left the archive's side door unlocked and slightly ajar, though she could not have said precisely what this was meant to accomplish. He appeared at the same position as before, at the boundary where the settlement's outer lantern light thinned to nothing and the dark between the trees began. He was exactly as large as she remembered, which she had half hoped would prove to be a distortion of memory. The way objects in nighttime recalled in daylight sometimes revealed themselves to have been smaller or less significant than the darkness had made them seem. He was not smaller. The moonlight fell across his shoulders like water across a stone, finding the gray and blue-black layers in his coat, and his eyes found her window with the directness of someone who knew exactly where to look. Mara did something she had not planned to do. She stood up from her desk, walked to the side door, and stepped outside. This was, by any reasonable metric, an extremely inadvisable action. She was an unmated omega stepping into the open within clear sightline of a supernatural wolf of unknown intention and apparently ancient origin. If she had read this sequence of events in someone else's account, she would have noted in the margin that the subject had made a suboptimal decision, but her body was doing the same thing it had done at the window the night before, moving with a certainty that did not entirely belong to her conscious mind, toward something that the deeper animal part of her seemed to have already assessed and reached conclusions about without consulting the rest of her. She stopped about 20 meters from the tree line, not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, because something told her that was the correct distance, that crossing further would be a statement she was not yet ready to make. The wolf watched her. The quality of that attention was extraordinary. It was not the attention of an animal watching prey or a threat. It was not even the attention of a very intelligent animal making calculations. It was the attention of a mind, a very large and very old mind, encountering something it had been looking for and taking the time to confirm that it had found it. Mara looked back. She was holding her notes against her chest, a sheaf of copied excerpts and her own annotations, because she had carried them out of habit and now felt slightly absurd standing in the pre-dawn dark in front of an enormous supernatural wolf with research notes pressed to her sternum. But she did not put them down. They felt important. They were important. They were the evidence that she had been paying attention, that she had been keeping the record, that she was the kind of person who took the trouble to know things that other people dismissed. She said quietly, "I know what you are." She was not sure what she expected. She was not sure she expected anything. But the wolf went completely still, in a way that was different from his previous stillness, a stillness that had a quality of recognition in it. And then he dipped his enormous head, slowly, in something that was unmistakably a response to what she had said. Mara's heart did something complicated in her chest. She said, "I've read the records, the ones from 300 years ago, and the older ones, the fragments. I know about the silver convergence." She paused. "I know you're early." The convergence was still 9 days away. Whatever had pulled him from the forest, it had not waited for the astronomical alignment. Mara had been thinking about this, and she had a theory, which she kept to herself for now because theories required evidence before they became statements. The wolf looked at her steadily. Then he did something she had not anticipated. He lay down. Not the way animals lie down when they are exhausted or when they are making themselves smaller to be less threatening. He lay down the way a very large thing settles when it intends to stay somewhere, folding into itself with a slow deliberateness, and he set his enormous head on his forepaws and looked at her. And the amber eyes were patient in a way that centuries would produce in something that had survived them. Mara stood in the pre-dawn dark and looked at the first king of Thornwood lying in the grass at the edge of his own ancient territory, and she thought about 11 years of being invisible, and she thought about what it meant to be seen by something that old and that certain, and she breathed carefully until her heart settled into something approaching a normal rhythm. She said, "I'll come back tomorrow." She went inside. She sat at her desk and wrote for 3 hours without stopping, setting down everything she had observed with as much precision as she could manage, because she was the archivist of Thornwood, and whatever happened next, there would be a record of it, and it would be accurate. If you're watching this and you've got chills right now, you're in the right place. Drop a comment below telling me what you think she's going to do next, because this story is just getting started, and I want to know if you see where this is going. Don't forget to hit like if you're invested, and if you're not subscribed yet, now is absolutely the time, because you do not want to miss what happens on night 3. The wolf was there the following night, and the night after that, and each time Mara went out to meet him at the boundary. They had developed, without discussion or formal agreement, a kind of protocol. She came to the side door of the archive when the settlement had quieted for the night. She walked to the boundary. She stopped at the same distance. She spoke, telling him what she had found that day in the records, what she understood, what she was still uncertain about, and he listened with that extraordinary focused attention that she had never in her life received from a person, and was receiving now from something that was technically not, at the moment, a person. And then she went back inside, and he stayed at the boundary through the night, and she worked at her desk with the side door open. And sometimes she would look up from her notes and see him there, a darker shape in the dark, and the quality of the night felt different with him in it, fuller, less hollow. On the 5th night, she told him about the earlier failed encounter, about the archivist Solon and the council that had imprisoned the ancient, and the decision that had sent him back into the forest for another 3 centuries. She read from her copy of Solon's account the precise original words, because she thought that mattered, that he should hear it as it had been written, rather than filtered through her summary. She read the last line out loud. I believe he was telling the truth. I believe we failed him. I believe he will come back. The wolf was quiet for a long time after she stopped reading. The amber eyes were very still. Then he made a sound, low and deep. Not a howl and not a growl. Something in between. Something she did not have a word for, and it resonated in her chest cavity in a way that the sound had no business resonating, as if it were vibrating something inside her that corresponded to a frequency she had not previously known she carried. She said, quietly, I know. I'm sorry, on behalf of all of us. It shouldn't have happened that way. The wolf looked at her. She had, she realized, begun to think of his expressions as readable in the way that people's expressions were readable, which was either a sign that she had been spending too much time alone, or a sign that there genuinely was a mind behind those eyes that was legible if you paid the right kind of attention. She thought it was the second one. I need you to understand something, she said. When you shift, and you will, the council is going to have opinions about it. Roran will have opinions about it. The senior alphas will have opinions about it, and those opinions will probably involve words like threat assessment and territorially verification and whatever version of those concepts they use when they want to sound authoritative about things they don't understand. She paused. I'm telling you this, not because I think you need to be afraid of them. Obviously, I don't think that. But because the last time this happened, you left before there was an opportunity to resolve anything, and I would prefer not to see a repeat of that outcome. She had thought about this a great deal. She had sat with Solon's account and thought about failure modes and intervention points, and what was different now compared to 300 years ago. The main thing that was different, she thought, was her. Solon had been a witness. She was something more than that. The wolf's amber eyes were very steady on her face. She had the feeling, not for the first time, that he understood considerably more of what she said than should have been possible from a wolf's cognition, and that this was because the wolf's cognition was not the cognition she was working with. I'll be there, she said, when it happens. I'll be there. She did not fully understand why she was making this promise. She understood it the way you understand something that arrives in you fully formed, without having been assembled piece by piece from reasoning, that she was not going to let this go the way it had gone before, that 300 years was long enough for one failure, that whoever or whatever she was in the architecture of this ancient story, she was not going to be the part that stayed in the background while history made the same mistake twice. On the 7th night, she told him her name. This might seem like a small thing. It was not a small thing. She said, My name is Mara. I'm the archivist of Thornwood, which means I'm the person responsible for keeping the records of this pack, the history, the documentation of what happened and when, and to whom. I've held this position for 11 years. She paused. I'm 31 years old. I'm an Omega, which I expect you can already tell from my scent. And I'm unmated, which is unusual for my age in this pack's current social structure, but is the result of a series of informed decisions rather than an absence of opportunity. She was not sure why she included that last part. It felt important that he know it, that she was here by choice, that she had made choices, that she was a person who made choices rather than a person to whom things happened. I don't have a wolf. This was the most significant thing she had said yet, and she knew it when she said it. To be a pack member without a wolf was not uncommon in itself. A small percentage of the population carried the designation without the shift ability, and while it was a marker of reduced status in most pack hierarchies, it was not exceptional. What was exceptional was saying it to the ancient supernatural creature at the boundary of the territory, because it was relevant information, because the old records she had spent, the last 7 days immersed in, had certain things to say about the Maid of the Ancient that were relevant to the absence of a wolf. She said it because she needed him to know who she was. All of who she was. Not a curated version, not the safe parts. If this was what she thought it was, then the foundation of it needed to be real. The wolf was very still. Then, slowly, he rose from his resting position and stood to his full height, and Mara had to actively remind herself to keep breathing, because the full height, close up, in the moonlight, was genuinely extraordinary, and something in her animal self wanted to respond to it in ways she was managing with deliberate effort. He took 3 steps toward her and stopped. He was close enough now that she could see the individual layers of his coat, the dark gray-black overfur and the paler underlayer, and close enough that she could feel the heat coming off him, which was considerable, because the metabolism of something that large ran very warm. He lowered his head until his nose was level with her face. He was looking at her at eye level, and this close the amber eyes were extraordinary, deep and layered and ancient, and she could see that they were doing exactly what she had thought they were doing, looking at her specifically, seeing her, not what she could provide or what role she could fill, but her, the particular and irreplaceable her that she had spent 31 years being told was insufficient. She held very still. She said, "Hello." The wolf exhaled. The warmth of it moved across her face, and she felt it in the roots of her hair, and in the base of her spine, and in some place behind her sternum that she did not have a name for. And then, with a slowness that was not hesitation but ceremony, he pressed his nose very gently to her forehead. Mara's eyes closed. She did not decide to close them. Every cell in her body went very quiet and very warm at once, and she understood, standing in the dark in the pre-dawn silence of the Thornwood settlement, that she was not going to be able to think of herself the same way after this, that something had just been marked that had been unmarked before, and not by force, not by dominance, but by recognition, by being known. She stood there for as long as the moment lasted. When he pulled back, she opened her eyes and looked at him, and she said, very quietly, "Okay, I see." She went back inside. She sat at her desk for a long time without writing anything. Then she wrote everything. You absolutely need to like this video right now if you felt that. That moment right there. I know you felt it, and I need you in the comments telling me. Did you see that coming? Did you know from the beginning what she was to him? Because not everyone did. Not everyone does. Share this with one person who needs a love story this week. Okay, back to Mara. The Silver Convergence arrived on the 11th day. Mara had spent the intervening nights at the Boundary, and the intervening days in the archive, and she had not slept enough or eaten consistently, but she felt more awake than she had in years, the particular wakefulness of someone whose attention is fully engaged by something that matters, which is a different quality of consciousness than the performance of attention that gets you through days when nothing fully matters. She had prepared as well as she knew how to prepare. She had her documentation, the historical records, the cross-referenced evidence, the annotated account from Solon's record. She had written a summary she could present to the council in terms they would understand. She had thought through every objection she could anticipate, and she had answers for them. She had also, on the 9th day, told Elder Devon. This had been a calculated risk. Devon was 73 years old, had served as the pack's senior historian and cultural advisor for 4 decades, and was one of approximately 2 people in Thornwood whose opinion of Mara was not shaped entirely by her Omega status and her unmarried condition. He was also old enough to have a complicated relationship with institutional authority, having lived through 2 administrations and watched the council make decisions he disagreed with, often enough to have developed a certain skepticism about collective certainty. She had taken him to the window of the archive in the early morning, before the wolf retreated, and let him see. Devon had been silent for a very long time. Then, he had said, "The account of Solon." "Yes," Mara said. "The year of the Silver Convergence." "Yes." "And you believe?" Devon said, with the careful precision of someone who was working very hard to process something that strained the frameworks of his lifetime. "That this is the same entity." I believe it is, Mara said. I can show you the evidence. She showed him the evidence. He sat with it for 2 hours and then he said, the council is going to be difficult. I know. Roran is going to want to classify this as a territorial threat. I know. You're prepared for that conversation. It was not a question. He had known her for 11 years. He said it with the slight emphasis of someone who wanted confirmation, not information. Yes, Mara said. I'm prepared for it. Davin had nodded slowly. Then I'll support your presentation. I have standing on the council that you don't, and whatever you need me to do with it, I will do. She had thanked him, and meant it, and they had not discussed it further. They did not need to. The terms of their alliance were clear. The convergence began at midnight on the 11th day, when the 3 moons rose in their alignment, and the quality of the light changed in a way that was difficult to describe precisely, but that Mara had found notated in 4 separate historical accounts, with variations of the phrase, the light became older. She watched it from the archive window and felt it on her skin. A kind of resonance, a frequency she had felt before, but only since the wolf had arrived at the boundary, and she understood suddenly that the wolf was not waiting for the convergence to shift. The convergence was simply going to make what was already true more visible. She went to the side door. She went to the boundary. He was standing, not lying down, as he had been on most nights. Standing at his full height, with his head up, and the converging moonlight falling across his coat, and turning the gray-black to something that had silver in it. And Mara walked to her usual place and stopped. And they looked at each other across 20 meters of grass, in the oldest light in 3 centuries. The shift, when it began, was slow. She had expected it to be sudden, the way pack wolves shifted, a compression and reorganization that took 10 or 15 seconds at most. This was not that. This was like watching something that had been folded very small, very carefully, over a very long time, beginning to unfold. The enormity of him seemed to gather inward, not diminishing, but concentrating. And the light moved around the process in ways she did not have the physics to explain, and it lasted perhaps 3 minutes, and then it was done. He was standing in the grass at the boundary of his territory, and he was a man. Mara had the record. She had Solin's description. She had prepared herself for what the description contained. Tall, broad-shouldered, gray-black hair, amber eyes. She had thought she was prepared. She had not been fully prepared. He was tall the way ancient things were tall, not just in physical measurement, but in the way space arranged itself around him, the way the air deferred to him. His hair was exactly as the record described, falling past his shoulders, dark with the gray-blue undertone that his wolf form had expressed as an entire coat. He was not young in the conventional sense, and he was not old in the conventional sense. He was outside those categories, in the way that landscapes are outside. Those categories, in the way that the oldest trees in the dark forest that you could not encircle with 3 people linking hands, were not old so much as continuous. His eyes were amber, even in the converging moonlight, distinctly, deeply amber. He was looking at her. He looked at her for a long moment without speaking, and she looked back, and neither of them looked away. And then he said something in the archaic dialect, and she understood it, which she had not expected. She had studied the dialect extensively over the past 11 days, but she had not expected to understand it in real time, in his voice, which was low and resonant with the quality of something that had been shaped by a great deal of silence. He said, or rather, she understood him to say, with the awareness that she was doing something between translation and direct comprehension, "You read the old record." "Yes," she said. "You believed it." "Yes." He considered this. His eyes moved across her face with the same quality of attention she had experienced through the wolf's amber eyes, but more concentrated now, more immediate. He said, "No one believed it before." "I know," Mara said. "I read about that too." Something moved across his face that was not quite an expression, or was an expression that she did not yet have the vocabulary to read. He said, "You are not afraid." I'm a little afraid, she said honestly. But not of you specifically. More of the situation. He seemed to find this reasonable. You told me your name. Yes. You have been telling me things, he said. For 7 nights. Yes. You knew I could understand. I thought you probably could, Mara said. The records suggested a mind behind the wolf, not just animal cognition, and your responses indicated comprehension. I was operating on a reasonable inference. He looked at her. A reasonable inference, he repeated, in a tone that she could not interpret precisely, but that had warmth somewhere in it. Warmth and something else. Something like recognition that did not know what to do with itself yet. I'm an archivist, she said. I work with evidence. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a directness that was not unkind, but that left no room for misinterpretation, You know what you are to me. Mara breathed carefully. I have hypotheses, she said, based on the historical record. I don't have confirmed evidence. What would confirm it? I don't know, she said. I'm working on that. Corners of his mouth moved. Not a full expression. The implication of one in the territory of his face where expressions were still finding their footing after 300 years of absence. He said, You are going to document this. Everything, she confirmed. Is that a problem? He looked at her for another long moment. No, he said. It is correct. Everything should be documented. Someone should have documented it the last time. Someone tried, Mara said. Solon. He was a good archivist. The council didn't listen to him. Will they listen to you? Not immediately, she said. But I have a plan. His amber eyes were steady on her face. Tell me. So she told him. Standing at the boundary of Thornwood territory in the converging moonlight of the silver alignment, she explained the pack's current council structure, the key figures and their dispositions, the arguments she had prepared, the role Elder Devon would play, the sequence in which she intended to present the evidence. She spoke clearly and efficiently, the way she would brief anyone who needed information to navigate a complex situation. And he listened with the focused attention she had come to associate with him, the attention that took everything in without filtering it through assumptions about what was relevant. When she finished, he said, You have thought about this extensively. For 11 days, mostly. And before that? She paused. Parts of it for 11 years, she said honestly, without knowing what I was thinking about. The warmth in his expression deepened. He said, Tell me your name again. Mara. He said it, in his voice, in the old dialect that was not quite the same as modern pack language, but that carried the root of it, the way a river carries the mineral character of the stone it flows through. And her name in his mouth sounded like something that had always had that shape, like the word had been waiting for that specific pronunciation. She said, What do I call you? Calum, he said. It was my name before it was a title. Calum, she said. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, the amber was very bright in the aligned moonlight. He said, I have been sealed for 312 years. I know. I have been aware, he said carefully, in the way that sleep is aware, not of specifics, but of time passing, of the territory changing around me, of the pack, generation over generation, above the roots of the old forest. Paused. And of something, a thread, thin and persistent, that I followed back here. Mara held very still. I did not know what it was, he said, until I saw you at the window of the archive. You were working. It was very late. Everyone else was at the celebration. His amber eyes were precise on her face. You were the only light on in that building, and you were working, and I knew. Mara breathed. She said, That's in the old records. The descriptions of your mate. Keeper of things. Who remembered. The one. Yes, he said. I wasn't sure how literally to take it. Very literally, he said quietly, as you should take most things that have survived 300 years. They survive because they are true. They stood in the aligned moonlight for a moment that had the quality of a door opening, of something that had been shut for a very long time beginning, in the most careful possible increments, to become accessible. Mara was aware that she was standing in her work clothes with her research notes that she had not slept enough in 11 days, that her hair was probably exhibiting the slight disorder it acquired after a long late session at the desk. She was also aware that none of this seemed to matter, in the specific way that things do not matter when something of larger significance is making the standard assessments irrelevant. She said, "We should go inside. It will be light in 2 hours, and I'd prefer to control the timing of the council's first encounter with you." Calum looked at her with an expression that was becoming more legible to her as the minutes passed, that had in it something she might, with sufficient care, call fond. He said, "You are managing this. I'm organizing the information flow," she said, "which is my professional function." "You are managing this," he said again, with the implication of an observation rather than a criticism, with something in it that suggested he found the managing interesting rather than presumptuous. He said, "Lead the way." She led the way. "If you are not subscribed to this channel, I need you to do that right now, because what is about to happen in that council room is everything. Do not watch this without being subscribed. I'm serious. Hit the button. Okay, good. Let's go." Alpha Prime Roran was not a stupid man. Mara had given him credit for this throughout her years of interaction with the council, which was not much interaction, because Omega archivists were not generally included in PAC governance conversations, but enough to develop a reasonable assessment of the people involved. He was not stupid. He was, however, a man who had held power for 18 years, through a particular combination of qualities, and those qualities had calcified in him in the way that successful strategies tend to calcify in people who have been rewarded for them. He was decisive in situations that called for decisiveness, moderately diplomatic in situations that called for diplomacy, and deeply uncomfortable in situations that did not fit neatly into either category. The situation she brought to him at dawn on the day of the Silver Convergence did not fit neatly into either category. She had made specific choices about the sequence and setting. She went to Devon first, at his private dwelling, and brought Calum with her. Devon opened the door and looked at Calum for a long, silent moment, and then stepped aside to let them in without saying anything, which was, for a man of his, communicative precision, a significant response. She made the introduction. She presented the essential evidence. She asked Devon to accompany them to the council, not as a supplicant but as a co-presenter, lending his decades of institutional credibility to what she was about to ask the council to process. Devon said yes. He also brought tea. She loved him for that. The council meeting was called for the 2nd hour of morning, convened by Devon on the grounds of urgent historical matter, requiring immediate deliberation, which was a legitimate procedural mechanism that he had not used in 11 years, but that everyone recognized. The 4 senior alphas arrived with the slightly put-upon expressions of people dragged from their routines for something they expected to be overblown. Roran arrived last, as was his custom, and surveyed the room with the assessing look of a man who had learned to read the emotional temperature of a gathering as a governance skill. He stopped when he saw Calum. The stop was complete, not a pause. A full stop, the kind that happens when perception encounters something that does not fit the existing model, and the brain requires a moment to attempt a refit. Calum was standing to the left of Devon, which put him in the periphery of the room's sightlines rather than at the center, a positioning Mara had chosen deliberately, and he was dressed in clothes she had procured from the archive's historical storage, which contained, among other things, a collection of formal garments from various periods that had been preserved as artifacts. The clothes were not from his era. They were more recent than that, but they were from an older period than the current fashion, and on him they did not look like costumes. They looked like what they were. A tall, amber-eyed man in old clothes who filled a room the way rooms were not generally filled. Mara stepped forward before anyone spoke. She had prepared for this. She had prepared for 11 days. And before that, in some sense, for 11 years. She said, in her clear archive voice, the one she used for formal presentations and the reading of historical record at PAC ceremonies, Alpha Prime, council members, Elder Davin has called this meeting because the archive has come into possession of information of significant historical and contemporary importance to Clan Thornwood, information that requires the council's attention and action. I will be presenting this information. Elder Devon will corroborate. I ask that you hear the full presentation before responding. Roran's eyes moved from Kylam to Mara and back again. He said, Archivist. Yes. Who is that man? That, Mara said, is what I am about to explain. She explained. She had timed it, in her head, when she practiced. 45 minutes if uninterrupted. It took 63, because there were interruptions, questions, objections, moments of incredulity that required her to hold her ground against the full weight of the council's collective skepticism, while presenting evidence calmly and accurately and without flinching. She cited sources. She produced copies of original documents. She walked them through the historical timeline with the methodical clarity that she had built over 11 years of explaining complex archival relationships to people who did not have her depth of familiarity with the material. She also, when the moment was correct, stepped aside and let Kylam speak. This was the risk. This was the hinge point. She had prepared him for it, in the hours between the convergence and dawn, walking him through the modern dialect and the contemporary concepts he would need to navigate the conversation, and he had listened and adapted with the particular quickness of a mind that had been old when the language was young and found its descendant forms interesting rather than confusing. She did not know precisely how much of the council's response would be in his control, ancient supernatural. Authority in a room with modern pack alphas was a variable she could not fully account for in advance. What she had not accounted for was that he would be subtle. He spoke with the authority of something that did not need to demonstrate authority. And this was, she realized watching it, a different and more powerful thing than what the alphas in the room were accustomed to. Roran and his senior council demonstrated dominance through the mechanisms of pack hierarchy, volume, posture, social, pressure, the accumulated weight of their position. Kylam did not perform dominance at all. He simply was what he was. And the weight of what he was so significant that performing it would have been redundant. He spoke clearly, answered questions directly, and when the council members' questions were based on misconceptions, he corrected them without condescension, with the patience of something that had been misunderstood before and had learned that clarity was more efficient than irritation. One of the senior alphas, a man named Gresham who had a reputation for antagonism as a governance strategy, said, "You claim to be the first king. That's a mythological category, not a real one. We don't build governance policy around myths." Kylam said, "The policy you currently govern by is built on decisions I made when this territory was established. The boundary markers in the northern section of the Dark Forest are set where they are because I set them. The spring in the Eastern Meadow runs where it runs because I redirected it 3 centuries before your grandfather was born. You do not govern a territory shaped by a myth. You govern a territory shaped by me." Gresham did not have an immediate response to this. Mara moved smoothly into the silence with the next point of evidence before he could regroup. It went on like that. Mara providing the documentation, Kylam providing the living testimony, Devon providing the institutional weight, the 3 of them, working in a coordination that had not been formally rehearsed, but that flowed from the clarity of their separate roles and the accuracy of their shared goal. And gradually, in the way that evidence accumulates past the threshold of reasonable denial, the room shifted. It was not a fast shift. It was not a comfortable shift. Roran in particular did not shift easily, and Mara did not expect him to, because accepting the truth of what they were presenting required him to accept that the territory he governed was not a sovereign authority, but the continuation of something much older than his bloodline, and that the oldest claim in the room was standing 6 feet to his left in clothes from the archives collection. But he was not stupid, and the evidence was thorough. And when Devon looked at him at the end of the presentation, with the level gaze of someone who had 40 years of institutional credibility behind him, and said, "This is real, Roran. I have examined the documentation myself, and I am telling you it is real." The calculation in Roran's expression shifted from denial to management. He said, "What do you want?" He was asking Kylam, But Calum said, "Ask the archivist. She is managing this." Roran looked at Mara. Mara had thought about what she wanted. She had been thinking about it for 11 days. She said, "Formal recognition of Calum's presence in Thornwood territory as a member of the pack, with all rights and protections thereof. No classification as a threat. No confinement. No attempt to remove him from the territory. Access to the archive for his full historical records review. A joint documentation project to reconstruct the history of the First Thornwood period, which is currently severely incomplete. And a review of the current territorial governance structure against the founding agreements, which have not been examined in 400 years, and which may have some consequential divergences from current practice." She had delivered this list at a deliberate pace, letting each item land before adding the next, watching Roran and the senior alphas process each one. The list began with what they would resist least, and ended with what would be most consequential over time. She did not lead with the last item. "You never led with the last item." Roran was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The documentation project. Yes. This is going to require significant archive resources. It will require my time and Calum's cooperation," Mara said. "The archive already has the necessary materials. We simply haven't had the primary source before." Another silence. Then Roran said, "The governance review. Long overdue," Devon said, with the mild certainty of someone who had wanted this for decades. Roran looked at Calum. Calum met his gaze with the level attention of something that was not competing with him, that had no interest in taking what he had, that was simply here and was going to remain here, and found the alpha's dominance. Performance irrelevant in the way that mountains find the weather irrelevant. Roran had, Mara suspected, never encountered anything that made his authority feel quite so contextual, and she watched him process this and make the pragmatic assessment that it was better to have this thing inside the governance structure than outside it. He said, "The terms are provisionally agreed. We'll formalize them in writing." "I'll draft the documentation," Mara said. Of course she would. The council meeting ended. The senior alphas filed out with the careful expressions of people who had agreed to something they had not fully metabolized yet. Devon stayed to speak with Roran for a few minutes in the private language of long institutional colleagues who understood that agreeing to something and being comfortable with it were different states that required separate processing. Mara stood near the door and waited. Calum stood beside her, close enough that she was aware of his warmth. The same warmth she had felt from his wolf form at the boundary, but more immediately present now, more legible as a thing that was about her specifically, and not just about proximity. He said, very quietly, for her alone, "The governance review." "Yes," she said, equally quiet. "That is the important one." "Over time," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You planned that." "I planned all of it," she said. "But that one specifically. The pack governance has diverged significantly from the founding agreements. The treatment of Omega-designated members in particular has shifted in ways that I don't believe the founding structure intended, and that I have, personally, some feelings about." He was looking at her with the warmth fully present now. Not implied, but actual, present in his expression in a way that she was becoming better at reading. He said, "You are going to use this to change things. I'm going to use the documentation to establish the accurate historical record," Mara said. "And then the accurate historical record is going to have certain implications for current policy, and those implications are going to be very hard to dismiss because the historical record will be impeccable." Calum said softly, "There she is." Mara looked at him. He was looking at her with something in his amber eyes that was not quite an expression she had a name for in her current vocabulary, but that she thought she could learn the name for, given sufficient time and attention. She said, "I told you, I work with evidence." He said, "Yes, and the evidence works for you." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, "We should go to the archive. There's a great deal to document." He said, "Of course." They went. "Okay, I need you in the comments right now." What did Roran's face look like when Calum said, "Ask the archivist"? Because I cannot stop thinking about that moment. The man who had been invisible running the entire negotiation. That is everything. That is what this story is about. Hit like if you felt that. And let's keep going, because we are nowhere near done. The weeks that followed the silver convergence were the most consistently absorbing of Mara's professional life, and she was beginning to understand of something beyond her professional life, though she was still in the process of building the vocabulary for that part. Caleb moved into the archive. This had not been formally proposed or formally agreed to. It had happened organically over the first 3 days after the council meeting, as it became apparent that the documentation work required his continuous availability, and that the archive's historical collection was, in some fundamental sense, his historical collection, and that he was more settled there than he was anywhere else in the settlement. Mara had a small private space at the back of the building that she used for late sessions, a sleeping cot and a desk and a narrow window that faced the forest. And she had, without deliberate decision-making, begun to also spend her nights there, with Caleb in the main room, working by lamplight in the particular companionate silence of two people who were doing different versions of the same thing and finding the proximity of it right. He worked differently than she did. She was systematic, moving through the material in a sequence she had planned, building the record layer by layer. He worked by association, by memory, by following a thread from one document to another, in a way that did not follow her organizational logic, but that produced connections she would not have found on her own, moments where two fragments that had been filed in completely different sections of the archive, separated by era and category and the particular organizational choices of 5 previous archivists, turned out to be pieces of a single event, separated by the imperfect record-keeping of a time when the events were too large for any one person to fully document. She watched him work, and she learned how to work with him. And this took about 2 weeks, which was faster than she would have expected, and which she attributed to the quality of his attention. He was very clear about what he was doing and why, and clarity was something she could follow. What she was less efficient at processing was the other thing. The mate bond, in modern pack physiology, was a recognized phenomenon, a chemical and neurological connection between compatible partners that produced, in its early stages, a heightened awareness of the other person, a pull toward proximity, a tendency to orient one's attention in their direction, even in the absence of conscious decision. She had read the clinical descriptions. She had categorized several historical accounts of it. She had, in the dry professional language of her field, understood it as a documented aspect of pack biology that produced measurable behavioral effects. She had not, from the clinical descriptions, understood that it would feel like this. It was not overwhelming. It was not the sudden blinding certainty that some romantic accounts described, which she had always suspected were retrospective embellishments. It was more like a new instrument in an orchestra she had been listening to her whole life, one that she had not previously heard because it had not been present, and that now, added to the existing composition, made the whole thing make sense in a way she had not previously known it was missing. She was more awake. The light in the archive was more specific. Food tasted like itself more precisely. These were the things she documented in her private journal, with the same precision she brought to everything. Because if she was going to experience something unprecedented, she was going to have a reliable record of it. She also documented that it was mutual. She had inferred this from the beginning, from his behavior at the boundary, and from the historical record's description of the mate bond in beings, of his nature. She had more evidence now. The way he oriented toward her when she entered the room, not performatively, but with the slight physical adjustment of someone whose attention has registered the presence of something significant. The way he made sure, without commenting on it, that there was always food near her desk at her usual working hours, because he had observed that she forgot to eat during late sessions, and had made the quiet institutional change of placing food within her peripheral vision so that she would encounter it. The way, when she was working through something difficult, complex documentary evidence that required sustained concentration, he would work in silence for as long as she needed, and then, when she surfaced from it, would be there with a question or an observation that picked up the thread of whatever they had been discussing before, as if no time had passed, and the thread had been maintained by his keeping. she was not efficient at processing. This, because she did not have prior experience with being cared for in this specific way, in the way that noticed the texture of her actual life and responded to it rather than to an idea of what her life should require. She had been competent and capable and reliable for 11 years, and in that time the people around her had been, largely, the beneficiaries of those qualities, without particularly attending to the person producing them. And now there was Kylum, who had been awake for approximately 3 weeks after 300 years of sealed sleep, and who seemed to have located the precise geometry of her actual life with more accuracy than anyone who had known her for a decade. She thought about this one evening when they were both working late, when the rest of the settlement had gone quiet, and the lamp between their desks made a small, warm island of light in the larger dark of the archive. And she said, without looking up from her notes, "How do you do that?" "Do what?" he said, also not looking up. "Pay attention like that, to the specifics of someone." She paused. "I've been trying to work out the mechanism." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think it is because I knew what I was looking for. Not who, but the quality of the thing, the one who kept the record, the one who remembered." He set down his pen. "When I found you, I was simply paying attention to what was already there. The specifics were yours. I only had to notice them." Mara looked up from her notes. He was looking at her across the desk. In the lamplight, with the amber eyes that had become, over 3 weeks, something she had incorporated into the texture of her days. The way you incorporate something necessary, something that, once present, you can no longer easily imagine the absence of. She said, "That's very clearly stated." "I try to be clear," he said. "I have had some experience with the consequences of being misunderstood." She held his gaze for a moment. She said, "I'm not misunderstanding you." "No," he said quietly. "You're not." The silence between them had a different quality than the working silence. It had the quality of something being decided, or rather something being acknowledged that had already been decided, in the way that things are sometimes decided in you before you have the conscious language for them, and the articulation is not the decision, but the recognition of it. She said, "I've been documenting the bond." "I know," he said. "You document everything." "It's useful," she said, "to have a record." "Yes," he said. And the warmth in his expression was complete now, fully present, not implied or held in careful reserve. "What does the record say?" Mara considered. She said, "That I am not afraid of it, that it is not what I expected, that it is better than the clinical description suggested, and more specific, and that the specificity is the part that I find most significant." She paused. "The clinical. Descriptions describe it in terms of the effect. They don't describe the cause, which is the actual person producing the effect." Kylum was very still. She said, "You are the cause. I want to be precise about that. This is not the bond producing an abstract feeling that is then attached to whoever is nearby. This is you, specifically, that I am responding to. The way you think, the way you work, the way you notice that I forget to eat." She stopped. She looked at him directly. "I want to make sure that's in the record." He said her name. Just her name, Mara, in his voice, in the particular register that had its own frequency in her chest. And then he stood from his desk, and she stood from hers, and they came around the two sides of the desk to meet each other in the lamplight. And what happened in that meeting was not the dramatic culmination of a build she had not been attending to. It was the opposite. It was the quietest thing, his hand against her face, her hands finding the front of his old-style shirt, and his forehead against hers, and the breath between them, and the bond recognizing itself fully, the circuit closing, the thread she had not known she carried becoming a connection between 2 points that had been looking for each other across centuries. She said, against his jaw, "This is documented." She felt him smile. She had not seen him smile fully yet, not completely, and she stored it for when she could see it. He said, "Everything, everything." She confirmed. "If you are crying right now, you are not alone. Drop a heart in the comments. This is the moment. This right here. And we still have so much story left, because this is not the end. This is the beginning. Stay with me. The opposition came 3 weeks later, and it came from the direction Mara had anticipated but not fully mapped. Not from Roran, who had made his pragmatic assessment and was managing the situation with the resigned competence of someone who understood that some variables were outside his control, but from the senior Alpha Gresham, who had not made his pragmatic assessment and who had, in the intervening weeks, apparently decided that the threat Calum represented was not to be managed, but to be eliminated. Mara found out about this the way she found out most things that the Council's alphas did not intend her to find, by reading the documents they generated, and that eventually found their way to the archive, where everything was her responsibility. The document was a proposal addressed to Roran from Gresham, outlining a set of arguments for the removal of the external entity from Pack territory on grounds of unauthorized historical claim and potential future territorial dispute. It was careful and legalistic, and built on a misreading of the founding agreements that Mara had spent 2 months documenting thoroughly enough to dismantle in approximately 4 minutes of focused citation. But the misreading was not the point. The misreading was the legal argument. The actual argument was in the last paragraph, which outlined a proposed action for Roran's consideration, and which was not legal argumentation at all. It was a plan. She read it twice. Then she took it to Calum. He read it once. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "This is old." "What is?" "This pattern. The advisor who believes the authority figure is too cautious. Who decides that the correct action is the one that cannot be undone." He set the document down. "I have seen it. Many times." "I'm sure you have," Mara said. "What I need to know is whether Gresham has the standing to execute this without Roran's approval." Calum looked at her. "You're asking whether the governance structure allows for unilateral action by a senior council member?" "Yes." "And if it does? Then we need to address that in the governance review before Gresham reads the same analysis I just read," she said, "which means accelerating the timeline." He was quiet. "Then, he will act before the review is complete." "Probably," Mara said, "which means the review doesn't solve the immediate problem. It solves the structural problem. We need a different solution for the immediate problem." Calum said, "What would you like to do?" She thought about it. She said, "I'd like to invite Gresham to the archive." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because the argument he's making is based on a misreading of the founding agreements, and the founding agreements are in this building, and I would like to walk him through them in person, in his own presence, with the original documents in front of him, so that there is no possibility of his claiming later that he was not aware of the accurate text." She paused. "And because I want to look him in the eye while I do it." Calum was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You want him to know you have read his proposal. I want him to know that everything eventually ends up in the archive," she said, "and that the archive is mine, and that I read everything." The conversation with Gresham took place the following morning. Mara had set it up the way she set up everything, deliberately, with attention to environment and sequence, with the documents she needed already in their positions on the table, with Calum present, but not prominent, at his own desk in the corner of the room, working, not positioned as a threat, but as a presence. Gresham arrived with the wariness of someone who knew he had been maneuvered into a meeting, and was not sure how to refuse it without acknowledging that he knew he had been maneuvered. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, the kind of senior alpha who had risen through pack hierarchy on a combination of physical dominance and political aggression. And he brought both of those qualities into the archive with him the way people bring their weather, the specific climate of their personality evident before they spoke. He said, "Archivist. Senior Alpha Gresham," Mara said. "Thank you for coming. I've been hoping for an opportunity to clarify some things about the founding agreement documentation. I understand there have been some interpretive questions." She walked him through it. The founding agreements, the actual text, the specific clauses that Gresham's proposal had misread, the historical context that explained why those clauses read as they did. She was scrupulously neutral. She did not accuse. She did not threaten. She simply read from the original documents, in her archive voice, with the precision of someone who had the text completely internalized and was presenting it as a courtesy rather than an argument. Every point Gresham's proposal had built on, she dismantled by reading the accurate text. Every misinterpretation, she corrected with the original language. She did not raise her voice. She did not hurry. When she was done, Gresham looked at the documents on the table and was quiet. She said, "Of course, all of this documentation is available to the full council at any time. I encourage comprehensive review." Gresham looked at Calum. Calum was looking at the document he was working on. He did not look up. He did not need to. He was simply there, in the room, with 300 years of patience available to him, and the weight of his presence said everything that he was not saying. Gresham said, "There will be more discussions." "I'm sure there will be," Mara said pleasantly. "I'm available to provide documentation support for any of them." He left. Mara sat down at her desk and breathed carefully until her hands stopped being slightly unsteady, a thing she had managed not to let show during the meeting, and that she allowed herself to acknowledge now. Calum set down his pen. He said, without looking at her, with the casual precision of someone who had been paying complete attention to everything she was doing while appearing to pay attention to something else. "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I'm fine. I just need a moment." He gave her the moment, exactly the right amount of it, without commentary. Then she picked up her pen, and they went back to work. Gresham did not act unilaterally. This was partly because Mara had made the documents he would have needed to misread impossible to misread in good faith after she walked him through them, and partly because Roran, in one of his periodic reassessments of the governance mathematics, had made it clear through back channels that he did not support the proposal. Mara knew this. Because Davin told her, and Davin knew because he was one of the back channels. The network of institutional knowledge in a long-established pack was intricate, and could be navigated by someone who had spent 11 years paying careful attention to which information flowed through which relationships, and Mara had paid that attention. The immediate crisis passed. The structural work continued. The governance review, conducted over 4 months with Mara as the primary researcher, and Calum as the historical source and Devan as the institutional liaison, produced a report that was the most significant document the Thornwood Archive had generated in 2 centuries. It established, from primary historical sources and comparative analysis with the founding agreements, that the current pack governance structure had diverged from the founding framework in 17 specific areas. Of those 17, 9 were minor administrative variations that reflected reasonable adaptation over time. 5 were substantive policy changes that had not been properly authorized under the founding process. And 3 were what Mara described in the report, with characteristic precision, as fundamental structural alterations to the rights and designations of pack members that are inconsistent with the founding principles and require remediation. The 3 areas requiring remediation were the treatment of unmated Omega-designated pack members, the exclusion of Omegas from governance participation, and the informal but institutionally reinforced social hierarchy that treated Omega designation as intrinsically inferior rather than as a specialist role with equal standing under the founding framework. The report took 4 months to write and 6 weeks to present to the council in full. Roran read it twice. The senior alphas read it with varying degrees of resistance. Gresham submitted a counter-analysis that Mara dismantled in 3 pages of citation. Davin advocated for the report's recommendations with 40 years of institutional credibility, and Calum, when the council finally convened the formal remediation discussion, sat at the table, not in a corner of the room but at the table, the first time in the process that he had been at the table, and when he spoke briefly, precisely, about what the founding principles had been and what they had been intended to protect, and the room was very quiet. The remediation package was passed, not unanimously, not without argument, not in the form that Mara had originally proposed in every detail, because governance never worked exactly the way you designed it in advance, but it passed. The essential protections passed. The exclusions were formally ended. The rights were formally restored. Mara sat in the council room after the vote, after the alphas had filed out, and Davin had pressed her shoulder briefly in the language of people who know the weight of what has just been accomplished. And she looked at the documentation she had spent 4 months producing, and she thought about Solon, who had been a good archivist, and had tried and had not had the standing or the time or the specific set of circumstances that had produced this outcome. She thought, we did it. And she meant the we in full, with all its components. Calum came to stand beside her. He looked at the council table, at the room, at the vote record that she was holding. He said, Solon would have been glad. Yes, she said, he would. A moment of quiet. Then, are you glad? She looked at him, the amber eyes in the document light, the face that was becoming as familiar to her as her own handwriting, the person who had followed a thread across 3 centuries and found her at a lit window in the dark. She said, I am enormously glad. In multiple directions simultaneously, he looked at her with the warmth that she had built over these months, the vocabulary to read clearly. He said, multiple directions, professional. Satisfaction, she said, ticking them off in the air. Institutional accomplishment, personal vindication, genuine happiness, and something that doesn't have a clean category in any of my current organizational systems. He said, that last one. Yes, she said, looking at him. That one. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her face, the gesture of someone who had been wanting to do something and had finally simply done it. And she leaned into it very slightly, the way a compass needle leans toward north, and they stood in the quiet aftermath of a vote that had just changed how Thornwood would govern itself for the next generation, and the bond between them was complete and documented and real. She said, I should write up the vote record, he said. Of course you should. She laughed. It was the laugh of someone who had not laughed quite like that in a very long time, genuine and surprised and warm. He watched her laugh. His expression, in response, was the expression she had been waiting to see fully, the smile she had felt against her forehead on the night the circuit closed, present now in his face completely, old and real and specific to her. She wrote up the vote record. He sat across the desk and read the founding agreements again, making notes on the areas that would require further implementation work. The lamp burned between them, and the archive was quiet, and it was exactly right. Before we get to the epilogue, I need a moment with you. If this story meant something to you, if you found yourself in Mara, if you recognized the particular experience of being competent and careful and invisible, and then finally seen, please share this video. Not because of the numbers, though the numbers help, but because there are people in your life who need this story today. You know who they are. Send it to them, and drop in the comments. What was the moment you knew? Tell me the exact scene. I read all of them. Okay. Epilogue. Time. 3 years after the Silver Convergence, the Thornwood Archive had 3 new staff members. 2 junior archivists who had been recruited from the general PAC membership under the new open designation hiring policy, and 1 research specialist with particular expertise in territorial history who had, the first time Mara showed him the early documents from the founding period, gone very still in the way that people go still when they encounter something they recognize from somewhere deep and old in themselves. The archive was also, as of 6 months ago, housed in a larger building. The old stone structure was still there, preserved as a historical site, because Mara had argued successfully that it was itself a document, a physical record of how the PAC had managed its institutional memory for 4 centuries, and that destroying it to make room for the expansion would be the kind of thing that future archivists would be very reasonably frustrated with their predecessors for doing. The new building was attached to the old one, sharing a wall, the old stone and the new material in conversation with each other in the way that good historical preservation worked, not erasing what had been, but building from it. In the old building, in the room where Mara had stood at the window and watched the wolf at the tree line for the first time 3 years ago, there was now a display case. It contained 3 things: a copy of Solon's original account, annotated in Mara's handwriting and Calum's, with the original archivist's text, carefully amplified by the subject of the account, and the archivist who had found it relevant 3 centuries later. A copy of the governance review report, the final version, with the council seal on it, and a small note, in Mara's handwriting, that read, "Everything documented. Everything true. The pack had changed. Not completely, not without friction, not in the ways that anyone who had a stake in the previous arrangements had found comfortable. Change of the kind that the governance review had produced was not comfortable for the people whose comfort it disturbed, and Mara did not expect it to be, and she did not apologize for it, and Kylum did not apologize for it, and the people it protected did not apologize for it. And over time, the friction of change became the new normal in the way that genuine change tends to. Once it has had enough time to become the water, everyone swims in rather than the disruption. Everyone is still adjusting to. Davon had retired 6 months after the vote, at 74 on his own terms, with a formal recognition from the council that had used language he had written himself, because he was 74 years old and had earned the right to write his own recognition language. He lived 3 houses from the archive and came by for tea twice a week. Mara liked this. Calum had developed what could only be described as a genuine fondness for Davon, in the way that ancient things develop genuine fondness for people who combined intelligence with the willingness to act on it, and their twice-weekly tea conversations were something that Mara, passing through the room, found herself stopping to listen to for longer than she intended. Roran was still Alpha Prime. He had, over 3 years, come to a complicated working peace with the situation that included respecting the archive's independence, consulting Calum on territorial history, with the careful reluctance of someone who knew they were getting useful information from a source they had complicated feelings about, and pretending, with decreasing conviction, that he had not been the primary beneficiary of the governance review's restoration of founding principles, because the founding principles had given him more legitimate authority than the inherited system he had been operating within, and more legitimate authority was useful even when its source was inconvenient to acknowledge. Mara had let him pretend. She was not interested in his acknowledgement. She was interested in the outcomes. On a morning in the 3rd year after the convergence, she woke in the archive's private room, which had been expanded somewhat since its original dimensions, and lay for a moment in the particular quality of morning light that came through the window that faced the forest. Kylum was already up. She could hear him in the main room, the sound of papers being moved with his characteristic precision, the slight sounds of the space being inhabited by a person who moved through it with complete familiarity. She lay still for a moment and listened, and felt the bond between them as a fact of her life, present and complete and ongoing, the thing that had arrived and stayed and become the warm structure of her days, in the way that necessary things become structural. And she thought about the version of herself 3 years ago, who had stood at this window in the dark and seen something at the tree, line, and walked outside to meet it. She thought, I would do it again, every part of it. She got up. She went into the main room, and he was at his desk, and he looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing it did, the shift of attention toward her that was never less than complete. And she went to the desk where the morning's documents were already laid out in the sequence she would need to work through them, and she sat down, and they began. Outside the archive windows, the dark forest stood as it had always stood, old and continuous, the trees too wide for 3 people linking hands to encircle, the roots so deep that the streams ran where the roots directed them, and had done so for as long as anyone had been keeping the record. In the oldest part of the forest, where the light came through the canopy in pieces rather than streams, the ground had a particular quality. It remembered. Not in any mystical sense, not in the way that stories sometimes required things to be. Mysterious, rather than true, in the simple archival sense of the word. The record was there, in the soil and the root structure and the shape of the land, if you knew how to read it. Mara knew how to read it. She was teaching her 2 junior archivists to read it. In time, they would teach others. The pack of Thornwood kept its history now. All of it. The accurate version. the complete version. The version that did not omit what was inconvenient, or categorize as myth what was true. The archive was full and growing. The record was being kept. Everything documented. Everything true. At the window of the archive, in the morning light, the archivist who had walked outside in the dark to meet something enormous and ancient and searching, and who had known what it was, and had not been afraid, sat at her desk and worked. The story had been here the whole time. She had only needed to read it. Thank you for watching. If you stayed for every single word of this story, she kept the record in the comments, and I will know you. If this is your first time here, welcome. This is what we do, and I hope you'll stay. Subscribe if you want more nights like this one, more stories with teeth and heart, and the kind of love that changes the architecture of everything around it. Hit like if Mara lives in you a little bit now, because she should. Share this with someone who needs to know that being the one who pays attention is not a small thing. It is everything. It is always everything. I'll see you in the next one.